Hi, Laura Jane back. And today on this video, I want to share some of what I learned over this past weekend at a conference that was a lot about education and parenting and childhood and even a different way of life for adults too. So I got to hear from one teacher in particular that really moved me and filled me. So this video I want to share what I learned from Peter Gray, who I got to go to 3 different workshops that or talks that he did, and soak up from him his understanding and perspective through research and teaching and writing for years now in the field of psychology and education, and he even does write for Psychology Today and has been conducting recent research, even looking at things like more, perhaps you might say, natural styles of parenting and contrasting that with some other ways that parents are going about things these days, and then also with education, looking at more self-directed education and what's happening with the kids who are actually experiencing that and studying them. So it was really a great way for me to fill up, and I want to share some of what I brought home because it really brought some things even clearer into my understanding and my passion to want to share some of these realizations as we take into account some of more of perhaps open perspective on how to handle children, for instance, and what education should look like and how learning can happen, and really looking at some of the changes that have happened in these recent years and factoring that into and correlating that with these also really high rates of disorder and unhappiness and even suicide rates with our kids, teens, and adults, but also these increased more than ever levels of things like anxiety and depression. We're going to look at how that really, in looking at the research, probably ties in to the changes that we've made as a society and as a culture, especially here in the West, especially here in the United States, with how we view children, how we view parenting, and how education is happening. So so I want to take you through some of my notes because I was in there learning for myself, but also thinking about you who might be interested, who wasn't able to be there and could really benefit from some of what I picked up and was exposed to. So the first workshop that I got to go to with Peter Gray was about play, and I think it was described about like play deprivation and looking at what's happening in the lives of children right now and how that's translating into adult life, and breaking that apart a little bit. So in the beginning, he defined more what play is and different aspects that would make something more like play, and some of the elements that are important to make something play. Like things like imagination is almost always part of play. How much other people to play with is such an important part of play. And I think I've also learned that, play, we now know, could be just anything we do just for the pleasure of it, or if we think we're doing it for the pleasure of it. And also play needs to be self-directed too, generally, in some aspects. So he was pointing out that over the past even just 60 years, there's been a real decline in play. He was looking back at when he was a kid in the 1950s, how different it was. And back in the 1950s versus today, if we look at children's lives, children, even if they were going to school all day, pretty much after school were free to play the rest of the day in the evening. And they were even free to roam the neighborhoods and go to the park by themselves and go out and play just with other children without the adults present, and have that be a real important part of their lives. So he points out that that was more of like a culture of childhood back then, and it's so important how the children were learning from other children and from their peers, and that's part of an important part of learning for children, is that time and space to do that in their playful ways. So he started to look at, like, since 1955, adults began to take kids' freedom away. In fact, we increased school and the time there, and we increased school-like activities, and this meant a decrease in playtime with the other kids. And again, that the kids to play with is one of the most important aspects of play. So he pointed out that we started to get this more schoolish view of child rearing, and that children may develop best when carefully guided by adults, and that maybe even play is a waste of time. So now he points out that childhood is more like resume building, which that right there, like, oh, it kind of crushed my soul when I heard that one. Childhood as resume building now. And pointing out some of the results we now see, and even correlating research and such with what's happening with the decline of play in children's lives in general. So we have seen a huge dramatic increase in levels and rates of anxiety and depression in kids and teens and young adults. He's pointed out that major depressive disorder is happening 8 times more than it was in the 1950s in teens and children. The suicide rates for children under 15 has increased by 4 times since the 1950s. Play and freedom and friends as so important, and that really this life without play is depressing. And life with all this adult supervision as well, and all the managing of the adults actually leads to more anxiety. He pointed out that when scientists were looking at the effects of play deprivation in, like, rats and what that did to their behavior when they had less of a playful environment, the actual substances that they used to knock out their play was very similar to what we are putting in our meds that we're giving to our kids, often that we're calling things like ADHD. So knocking playfulness out of our children so that they can focus on what the adults think they should focus on, right? So basically there's been a decline in young people's sense of control over their lives. So when they had all this freedom after school, at least, to go out and do what they wanted and direct their day and play freely with other children or by themselves if they were choosing, they felt like they had control over their lives. And that nowadays, perhaps, young people feel a lot less in control of their lives. And he pointed out, like, they were doing some tests with things called the locus of control scale, and looking at this really predicts how you feel about a sense of control over your life. And this predicts your mental health and even your physical health. If the degree to which you think that you're getting to decide versus things are just getting decided for you. And you start to see, like, people who either feel like they have a sense of control over their life or feel more and more like a victim either. So it's like you get wired towards this either internal locus of control or external locus of control, like, where's the direction coming from? So the more that we have our kids other directed, then that's where they start to think where, it's all, the focus needs to be is outside. And I know that happened for me, I think, in just becoming very school oriented. It became very, a whole big shift I needed to make to look back within. And so I really like the idea of helping my kids stay with that internal locus of control, like have a sense of control over their lives. And so, if you're always being controlled by others, it's really hard to develop a sense of control over your life. And in play, this is interesting, in play, children are in control. So when children are what we would call playing, that's one huge dynamic difference, is that they're in control of their moment, of their reality, of what they're even creating. So the more that we've taken that away from them, the freedom and the time and the space to even play, do activities that are not other directed, it's important. And then he even brought up that how we've seen this decline in emotional resilience maybe in our young adults, like this noticing of how the college students are so emotionally fragile and even entitled or something. And the increase even in mental breakdowns in college students and such. And so he also pointed out that one feature of this is that these kinds of kids who were maybe having these feelings were more likely to go to the authorities for their problems instead of finding ways to solve it themselves. So they had become very other directed in that they always look to someone else to solve their problem. And not that there's not some value to getting help, but there was just an interesting tie-in to that versus becoming more, when we deprive them of the play, they become less resilient, more dependent, and more fragile, actually, it seems, through even the research. And the more they're doing schoolwork and adult-led activities, they're actually these kids are having a harder time in college, because college does actually ask people to be more self-directed. And so a lot of these kids now that have been raised to be so other-directed are actually having a harder time making that adjustment in college, because that is actually the first time for some of them that they're taking ownership over their time and their day. And maybe they don't even know why they got it, either in college. Maybe it wasn't even something they chose. So more and more reasons to give our kids the freedom to choose in their days, in their moments, and even in their life path, right? Another thing, that when we're decreasing play, because some of the big things we develop in play, it turns out, is a lot of our social skills. So things like how to have empathy and how to have compassion, children actually develop in their playtime more than necessarily sitting next to their peer learning about something from the adults all day long. So we're seeing a real decrease in empathy in young people, and an increase in narcissism too, because a lot of these systems that are so other directed actually increase a focus on the self and a more increase towards being narcissistic versus looking out to how we can contribute. And again, the less time we have to develop those social relationships, like we would if there's more play, whatever age, even if they're 16, to have plenty of time for play is still important. So most play is social play, Peter Gray pointed out. So to realize the huge learning that's happening with play with other children, whether it's online or live, is social growth and learning about empathy and compassion and what it's like to create rules and live within them, and just trying out different parts of being human through play. But a lot about that social development is going to happen through play. And so when our kids aren't getting much time to play, they're actually not getting that time to develop that social resilience even, and attunement. And I think the things that we want for our kids, we're actually not giving them the time and space to do them when we forget that play is where they're going to do that, whatever the age. Self-directed play. And unfortunately, the more competitive things that children are doing, that does also tend to promote narcissism. So if you think, my kid's playing this team sport, there may be some elements in there that feel playful to your kid, or may not. But also that it does seem that in the research we see that the more competitive things that we do, that does tend to promote more narcissism versus maybe being more about cooperation and community. And then play and creativity, we see how important it is that the more we can play, the more creative we can be. And we're seeing now that creativity is down at all grade levels in ways that scientists are looking at it and researchers. So noticing this correlation between decrease in play and decrease in creativity, because again, a lot of when we're doing the other directed school-like approach with kids, that's not that often about being creative. It's often about being very more like uniform and conforming and just finding the right answer, not coming up with creative approaches so much. Is not so valued in a lot of those traditional ways of teaching kids. So it actually is perhaps training creativity out of them. And then when we're not giving them the space and time to play, again, whether they're 3 or 13 or 18 even, because we adults now, we're seeing how important it is to play in a way, and that's part of our mental health and our even physical health and emotional well-being, is to make sure we're finding ways to build in things that feel like play for us. So this is really leading edge wisdom for us adults, but it's like, wow, when we look at what this is doing to our children, when we're not giving them or honoring their play, or seeing play as a waste of time, or not as important as school, and not as much learning going on as school. Yeah. And then if you're interested in embracing that, you don't need to even ever have your kid doing anything that feels like school and be learning all the time, then this helps you see that bridge. Like, that's how we see our schooling lives, with our, what you could call unschooling, or I'm liking calling it self-directed education. Really, and my role as a parent is getting to facilitate that self-direction for my kids. And when they see what they do want to move towards next, helping them make that happen in every way that I can as a partner, and being their partner through it, and their friend. And it's exciting to see what they're choosing next, but they're very self-directed and very empowered, I'd say. And their lives would look like all about play, really. But it's fun to see what humans do when they can just be playful. They do things and learn things all day long. So anyways, that's a side note, which I'll make future videos about, I'm sure. But yeah, so it's basically Peter's pointing out that we think we're preparing kids for this world, and actually he's pointing out that we now know we're going to need humans that are more willing to be creative, actually, and coming up, breaking out of the box with thinking and stuff. So actually the way that we're preparing our kids for this world, by having them in all this school-like learning and adult-controlled time, we're actually not preparing them well for this world at all. So he says, what can we do to renew play? And suggest some books, like the Free Range Kids book. And there's a book about playborhood, and finding more ways to bring more freedom to get the kids out in the neighborhood and even playing with each other. But also things like seeing that taking risk calculation is part of play and part of developing courage. So when our kids play involves things that feel dangerous to us, we can, of course, listen to ourselves and act when we feel like we need to, but also honor that part of what's in play is risk-taking, and that's going to give them a chance to develop courage. So to honor that important part of play, the risk-taking elements and developing courage. And just, various ways we can bring play back into children's lives. So, and then, some of what Peter Gray also was talking about was in looking at the roots of some of our current education and why we started doing what we're doing in school right now, basically, with the traditional format of kids going to school, Monday through Friday, and being forced to go and forced to learn whatever is being presented that day, and contrasted that with looking back into more primitive times with humans and what was happening with children and education. So he did a lot of ways of looking at what was happening in those times, and talked to different researchers and looked at studies of what we know about human life back in those days. And it turns out that the children were allowed to pretty much just after about age 4 to roam freely and direct themselves all day long. And often the kids would just go out into the forest and play all day long with no adults around watching them. And then eventually they would start to get interest in tribal life, and they could always get involved with adult life, but the adults were doing their work and doing their hunting and gathering and preparing and various things, and the kids were always welcome to drop in and be a part of that when they wanted to, and did sometimes, and was a way that they were learning. But they also would just be out roaming free, learning that way, and then gravitating into adult life as they seemed to get various interests. And that some of what was most valued and treasured in that lifestyle was a developing of and a keeping of the free will of each individual, and the honoring even that each person was so different and bringing their own contributions. So this idea, though, that free will was the most important thing, and for the child to really learn to be in that free will and to follow that free will. So, and this, kids were said to actually be, he said, you'd think that would mean a bunch of kids running around crazy and like monsters. And no, actually they were pretty happy kids and really well behaved. And there was, harmony. And it wasn't expected that you just were parented by your parent, that the village would all be part of parenting each other's children when they did need help. So I thought that was really interesting to hear, and that some of the reasons that schooling was started was actually because of things like agriculture. When we started to have property almost, and that we were planting things, and now this ground became valuable, and someone needed to take care of it, and we couldn't quite roam and cruise as much even as a people, because suddenly now we had planted things, and this was like a harvest that we were committed to. So that started to change the lives of the tribe, and they started to want to have something to do with the kids, and they started to create the first schools. And undeniably, the first schools were actually developed to suppress free will. So schooling was really built to kind of beat the free will out of children. And then actually some of the first schools were built around one of the only books around that talked about parenting at all, which was the Bible. And, there's potentially a lot of great stuff in the Bible. But some of the things, if you look at what they do say in there about child rearing, and Peter Gray did read the few, like Deuteronomy 21 and Matthew 15:4, as some of the kind of harsh talk about children and how we should force them and even be willing to physically beat them, maybe into some suppression of free will, things like this. So they use that as some of the influence for how they were going to go about things in the schools, and develop this compulsory education where it was suddenly the children had to be in school. And then in this approach, it started to see that, and in the biblical approach back in those days, freedom and play was seen as more like the devil or like sin. So it was definitely about let's even avoid this time for freedom and play. And so that school was literally to break the natural willfulness of the child. So the school officials became the ones in charge of stifling this willfulness of each child. And so today's schools are descendants of these schools that were about obedience training and also indoctrination. So the current classrooms, I don't know if we can transform them, but maybe, he says, even abandon them and go towards more like learning centers. Some of what Peter Gray's talking about is, yes, calling it more about self-directed education, which I like a lot. And, just redefining education versus schooling. And that maybe, what's beautiful about more of a self-directed education is that because we all do have different interests, that's what could make our culture so rich and actually flourish, as if we had an education system that actually encouraged us to develop our uniqueness versus all of us learn the same things and try to be similar in that way. So it's just a real different look at what education means and whether or not it's a good idea for us all to learn the exact same things, or if it might be more rich and interesting if we're all learning along our way, and free will as the priority and self-direction as the approach, and actually creating even more powerful self-directed people in the world who are on purpose, maybe even more in their passion, more playful, probably more emotionally healthy. And that is some of the final stuff that I got to hear from Peter Gray, is studying and hearing from some of the children who were raised more freely through these methods called things like unschooling, and getting to hear from them about what their current lives are like, and their work life, their social life, their health, their feelings of well-being, what they thought about being unschooled. And the results were pretty cool and great to hear, and some pretty deep and meaningful things, like just more, they felt like they had probably learned more, and their learning was a lot deeper because they had the freedom to go as deep as they wanted with their learning when they felt like it. That they had better relationships with their parents, that family harmony was definitely improved by a household where self-direction is the thing, and that even sibling relationships a lot better and closer. And all of them had gone to university if they wanted to and had no problem assimilating. If there were gaps in their learning, like probably all of us have had, they had no problem self-directing and finding the ways to fill that in, just like any self-directed learner would do, just making that the next thing to learn next, and just getting really good at moving towards and creating lives that even seem to feel more on purpose, maybe more essential. And great feedback from what we're seeing with people who have been raised like this, and the differences in their life and sense of control, right? Sense of locus of control. So yeah, I loved what I learned, and you can keep learning with Peter Gray. He writes for Psychology Today, and I'm so thankful for his work, and thank you so much for listening with me, being here with me, and I hope this was helpful to get some of what moved me in learning at the HSC Conference in San Francisco this last weekend. And if you want to know more about HSC's upcoming conferences, I think you can go to hsc.org. They were the organization that hosted Peter Gray this last weekend. So thank you, and here's to what we can do to nourish our kids, nourish ourselves, and